and welcome to one of our Answers Weekly Wraps. I'm Viv Govender, and our usual format will follow today. We'll start off with a couple of macro news stories and end up with a tech segment at the end. In our macro segment, we're going to cover similar stories to what we've covered over the last couple of weeks. Unfortunately, due to the current importance of these stories as well as developments that have been occurring, it's really impossible to get away from them. The first one is going to be on the current situation in the Middle East. The second is going to be on interest rates and inflation. Then in our tech segments, we'll cover two things. It's going to be ASML's downturn in terms of demand, as well as Tesla's robotaxi venture. So starting off with the Middle East. Over the last weekend, we had an attack by the Iranians on Israel. It was in the form of drones and missiles. Very few casualties. I think nobody was killed, I believe. There was very little damage as well done. Most of the missiles and drones were basically shot down by the Israelis, but they were also assisted by people like kind of semi-allies like the Saudi Arabians as well as the Jordanians. This particular success should not be indicative of a inability of Iran to attack Israel. Rather, it should be taken into consideration that the Iranians pretty much targeted areas that were not going to be near civilians. They broadcast the attack well in advance. It was not a surprise attack. And they pretty much kind of give the ideas to what they're going to be targeting. And from the Iranian point of view, this pretty much worked out as kind of how they wanted it to work out. They wanted to show that they were willing to use force, but they didn't want their force to actually do any kind of harm. That was what they wanted to do. They were looking to de-escalate the situation effectively. Now, to remind yourself what's happened here, October 7th was caused by the Palestinian group Hamas, but Hamas to some extent is supported by the Iranians. So is Hezbollah up in Lebanon, and they're also players in Syria as well. The Israelis basically are not too keen about what's been happening with regards to Iranian support, and they have an approach that they call attacking the head of the octopus. The idea would be that Iran has various tentacles out there, the Hamas and the Houthis and Hezbollah, etc. And so when those tentacles attack Israel, Israel will attack the head, which is Iran, which is kind of punishing the people who are actually responsible and not just the proxy. This, may or may not be, wise in the current situation, but we have seen this policy kind of go out. So what happened most recently was, like I said, October 7th, Israel partially blamed the Iranians. And then recently, the last few weeks or so, they attacked a senior military officer from Iran in Syria. Attacked him in what may or may not have been an embassy. People say it's adjacent to an embassy. Some people say it is an embassy. Attacking an embassy for any reason is considered to be very taboo in international circles, almost a declaration of war. So if it had been an embassy, it would have been a very serious thing. It was kind of adjacent to the embassy, so it wasn't quite as serious. The Iranians basically needed to respond to this, or felt they needed to respond to this, but they don't want to escalate things. They don't want to get into a full-on war with Israel. And so that's what they did. They basically shot some missiles, some drones at Israel, but like I said, they wanted very little any damage to be done. They didn't want to kill anybody. So they've done this. Now they've come out and said, okay, we think this is done, no more problems, and let's all go around and not attack each other again. The Israelis, on the other hand, I think are probably going to have to respond to this. They cannot just sit aside and let an Iranian attack occur without a response, but it depends on what kind of response they're going to give. Are they going to do something similar to what the Iranians did? A response, but not really try to attack anybody, not try to kill anybody, not try to do too much damage? Or are they willing to basically, escalate things by attacking again with the intent of being, of killing somebody or doing some serious, harm to infrastructure, etc.? As I speak, we have not yet seen that response from the Israelis, but I do expect it to happen in the next couple of days. Now, the question arises, what's going to be the impact of this? As I mentioned before, this is far more economically important to the world than what's happening right now in Gaza. Gaza is virtually no economy, doesn't connect to any trade routes. There's almost no impact to the global economy. If, however, Israel and Iran get into a war, the impact on the global economy could be massive, far larger than you would think. Iran controls, or at least has some control over a piece of water to the south of it called the Straits of Hormuz. They're able to, for instance, put mines. They could use drones and other means to stop the transport of natural gas and oil, especially through that region. A huge chunk of the natural gas and oil that comes from the Middle East goes through that particular bit of water. If it was blocked, places like India, China, much of Asia would find it very difficult to access those natural resources that they often need for their economies to function. So you'd be knocking off India and China, quite badly. In addition, it will obviously affect the exporting states in the Gulf as well. In addition, Iran has the ability to a certain extent influence or support the Houthis, and that could control, or that could not control, but could rather impede, shipments through the Red Sea, which is effectively the Suez Canal, and so you'd be blocking off the easiest way to get from Asia to Europe, and therefore you'd have to go around us, basically in South Africa, to get to Europe. That would be a huge issue as well. Significantly decrease the efficiency of transport between Asia and Europe. In addition to that, there's other ways that Iran could, possibly attack. They've shown the ability to use some cyber weapons, so they've taken attacks on the grid in Israel. Maybe they might be having similar things in other parts of the world, for instance, in Europe or in America. Iran is an ally to a certain extent of Russia and has supplied them with drones historically. For those that don't know, one of the big contentious issues with Iran is their ability or their willingness to, develop nuclear weapons. Right now, it's pretty clear that they've gotten very close to nukes a couple times. Some people said it's 6 months, some people say it's a year away from actually being able to develop nukes. So they not like they're going to do it in the next year or so, but if they wanted to, it'll take them about 6 months to a year to do it. So they've gotten to the brink and they've kind of halted them. And that was the latest round of sanctions against them. That's what they sought to do, kind of reduce the ability of them to produce weapons in a short period of time. So increase that 6 months to a year to maybe 2 or 3 years or whatever it may be. Since the sanctions basically agreement ended between the US and Iran, we're not quite sure as to how far away they are. Some people believe that they may be not that far away from actually having a functional nuclear weapon. That is a very different situation than Iran without nukes. Iran with nukes basically can almost attack Israel with impunity, because what are they going to do? Attack back when it's a nuclear armed power? That is a very dangerous world to live in. What would Russia do? To a certain extent, Russia has been kind of semi-cordial with Israel. A lot of Israelis are Russians or Russian speakers. Roughly 20% of the population or so of Israel is basically immigrants from Russia. So there is a connection between Israel and Russia. But Israel has to a certain extent been supporting Ukraine, so that might be something that factors into things as well. And then finally, what will be the US response to this? The US right now has said that they basically don't want to have this escalate and would want Israel to basically act with a bit more discretion or conservativeness. I don't know what influence they have at the moment. The US technically has a lot of influence of Israel, but politically and for other reasons, Israel does seem to be able to do what it wants to at the moment without getting too much of a reprimand from the US. So again, the situation, like I said, very volatile, and probably by the next time we speak next week, it's going to be after the Israel attack, and we'll see what the implications of that are. Next, we had some inflation numbers out of the UK. UK inflation had fallen, but it came in a little higher than expected. We also had inflation numbers out of the EU as well, also down, down to about 2.5%, below 2.5%, or just above 2.5% rather, from 2.8 to 2.6. This is, I think, a big positive that we are seeing happening in Europe, especially the fact that inflation is falling. The UK, like I said, falling, but not as much as it hoped for, and therefore that's a bit of a problem. But in the EU, we're getting close to that 2% level. And what that does mean is we might find a discrepancy between policy in the EU and what's happening in the US. The EU may be able to cut interest rates faster than the US is. Like I mentioned last time, US inflation came in higher than expected. And in addition to that, if you look at the super core inflation, which is a new term that they've been using for the last little while. Core inflation, if you don't know, is inflation minus food and food and fuel. Sorry. So food and fuel inflation is considered to be volatile, and therefore, you want to take it out to find the underlying inflation. Supercore takes out food, fuel, as well as shelter. And that is considered to be the underlying inflation in the economy. And if you look at that number for the US, you would find that underlying inflation for the US economy, the supercore inflation, was up 4.8% in the last 11 months. And if you annualize the growth rate for the last 3 months, it will be up to 8% per year. So not only is it higher than CPI, it's higher than CPI, and it seems to be accelerating. A 4.8% to an 8% acceleration rate is pretty huge. And what could be driving this? Services, we could be talking about. They were mentioning the fact that insurance for house and for cars was quite high. So there's a number of factors, and also property taxes were also quite high as well. So looking at what's happening in the US at the moment, it's quite clear that them cutting interest rates reasonably soon is out of the question. The EU is a bit different. I think with the inflation rate closer to 2%, like I said, number 2% at the moment versus number 3% for the US, and coming down as far as the US is rising. I would say it's likely that we'd see a cut from the EU before we see a cut from the US. What that would mean in terms of currency movements, I think probably mean the US would strengthen versus the EU. It could mean that we could see a bit of an uptick, especially in European stocks, before we see some of the US stocks rise up because of inflation, interest rate cuts. And to a certain extent, the European stocks have been under the thumb for a while now. They have not performed as well as the US stocks, and therefore this might be a bit of a closing of that gap. Okay, now moving on to our tech segment, ASML came out with some results. They showed a surprise drop in demand for their, machines that are used to build these, chip making companies, factories, especially from the east. TSMC, Samsung, both were reducing demand. This is a bit of a surprise. It's not a surprise as to the fact that that mobile phone demand is coming down. With high interest rates, with global uncertainty, and the fact that to a certain extent, mobile phones are almost a mature technology. It's like TVs. You don't buy a new TV just because the TV's got better. You buy a new TV when your old TV broke. To a certain extent, that's not quite the same when it comes to phones. We still do buy new phones when all phones are still working, but we wait a few years. We wait for support for certain things fails, or we wait until basically the gap between the new and the old one is large enough to justify it. And that is a bit of a change from what we saw a few years ago, when basically every new model that came out was significantly better than the previous model and kind of forced you to go up in rank if you wanted to keep up with technology. Right now, that's not the case. You could have a 2 or 3 year old phone and it's pretty functional in terms of, especially the flagship phones. So that's come down. And at the same time, some of the demand around AI chips has not yet got into the full gear. And so, yes, the results were a bit disappointing for ASML. The stock fell about 4% on the day. And then finally, let's look at Tesla and what's been happening there. So Tesla has come out with some big moves over the last week. Firstly, they've cut they're only going to cut the global workforce by about 10%, which is a surprise. Tesla has usually been in a situation where they've been trying to expand production all the time. That usually takes more workers. The fact that they're willing to basically cut 10% of the workforce, or a little more than that, in fact, could indicate that they're finding issues with regards to demand for their vehicles. We also saw a couple of key people leave the company. Some senior executives have left the company, which also may indicate an issue. And in terms of their legal battles, Tesla is doing 2 things at the moment. Firstly, they try to push through the same package they had for Elon Musk in 2018. Again, the same package was rejected by the judge. The argument by the judge was effectively that, of the judge Delaware, was effectively that shareholders weren't completely informed of what they were basically signing up for. The board's come out and says, hey, the judge says you weren't informed about these things. Now you're informed. Do you still vote for it or not? That is pretty much what they say. The second thing is that there's been apparently a pivot internally towards robotaxis. Now, if you look at Elon Musk's initial plan around SpaceX, robotaxis was kind of like his go-to idea. Robotaxis would be, imagine you buy a Tesla, and then you get it to drive it to work and drive you home. But for most of the Tesla does nothing. If, however, the Tesla was operating as a robotaxi with a self-driving facility, what it could do was it could take people around places, act like an Uber vehicle while you were working, while you were not using the vehicle, and earn you an income. Now, The Tesla model kind of works with the idea that they'd get about half of that income. But still, if you were getting, effectively an Uber, vehicle out there, driven while you're not in that vehicle, earning your income from an asset that you purchased, it turns, transport from an expense into possibly an investment opportunity, and it could be very lucrative for Tesla. If this thing does come into play, kind of justifying to a certain extent its very high valuation. I mentioned this before. If you look at it purely as a car company, there's no way you can value Tesla as highly as it is. It should be worth a fraction of what it is right now. In fact, a fraction of a fraction, 20%, maybe even lower than that, 10% of its kind of valuation. But if you include things like, for instance, its robots or its AI or its robotaxi facility, maybe we might be seeing a closer valuation to what it is right now, and maybe even much more than it is right now. So this robotaxi thing is playing out. At the same time, like I mentioned, what's happening with regards to the cases, with Elon Musk. Number one, like I said, they are basically trying to push through the current or the old package again in the same way. And they're also looking to move from Delaware to Texas, rehoused, because they say Delaware is anti-Musk or anti-Tesla as a state. Now, these things will all be linked up. As conspiracy theory, one might say that Musk sees, shaking things up at Tesla means he's more needed. If Tesla was a company running on as it should be, without any kind of major decisions to be made or major developments happening, one could say that we don't really need to pay somebody $50 billion to come around this company. If on the other hand, this company is about to go through one of the biggest revamps and have a new technology, that's robotaxis, I could argue quite easily that I would trust nobody else in the world besides Elon Musk to try and start a robotaxi company. This is something that nobody else has proven to be able to do, and Musk has proven to be able to do this multiple times with SpaceX and Tesla and so on. So this kind of reinforces the case as to why you'd want to basically be voting to that package for him, that $50 billion package, and at the same time, including the package vote as well as the relocation vote at the same time, would seem to indicate that they want to basically take out the excuse that Delaware might have to revoke that movement of the headquarters from Delaware to Texas by saying these can't be linked because they're happening at the same time, so one is not dependent on the other. Okay, so at the moment Tesla is down again. It's down significantly off highs. Still, however, the most valuable car company in the world by a large margin, and still, if you just think of it as a car company, massively overvalued. Okay, thanks for joining me today, and I look forward to speaking to you guys again next week. Cheers.